The desert wind carried sand across the tarmac as Sarah Mitchell stood before the massive Apache helicopter, her flight suit still crisp and new. The morning sun had barely risen over Fort Rucker, Alabama, but the heat was already building. She ran her hand along the helicopter's armored skin, feeling the rough texture beneath her fingers. This machine was built for war, designed to strike fear into enemies and provide devastating firepower from the sky. For Sarah, it represented something more personal. It was proof that she belonged here, despite what dozens of people had told her over the years. Growing up in a small town in Montana, Sarah had always been fascinated by aircraft. Her father worked as a mechanic at the local airport, and she spent countless hours watching planes take off and land. While other girls her age played with dolls, Sarah built model helicopters and studied flight manuals. Her bedroom walls were covered with posters of military aircraft, and she could identify dozens of helicopters by their silhouette alone. Her parents supported her interests, even when neighbors whispered that it was unusual for a young girl to be so obsessed with military machinery. When Sarah turned 16, her father took her for her first helicopter ride. The pilot was a retired Army aviator who occasionally gave tour to help pay for his own flying hobby. As the helicopter lifted off the ground, Sarah felt something click into place inside her. The sensation of hovering above the earth, the responsive controls, the way the machine moved in 3 dimensions, it all made perfect sense to her. She knew in that moment exactly what she wanted to do with her life. She was going to fly helicopters, not just any helicopters, but combat helicopters for the United States Army. Her high school guidance counselor tried to discourage her. Women had only recently been allowed into combat roles, and the culture was still catching up with the policy changes. The counselor suggested nursing or teaching, careers that were more traditional for women. Sarah smiled politely and ignored the advice. She threw herself into her studies, excelling in math and physics. She joined the ROTC program at her high school and finished at the top of her class. Every decision she made was calculated to bring her closer to her goal. College was at a state university with a strong ROTC program. Sarah majored in aerospace engineering while completing her officer training. She woke up at 5 every morning for physical training, attended classes all day, and studied late into the night. Her social life was nearly non-existent, but she didn't care. While her roommates went to parties and worried about dating, Sarah practiced navigation calculations and memorized aircraft specifications. She graduated with honors and a commission as a second lieutenant in the United States Army. Flight school was where the real challenges began. Sarah arrived at Fort Rucker expecting to prove herself through hard work and skill. What she found was an environment that wasn't quite ready for women in combat aviation roles. The instructors were professional, but some of the other students made their opinions clear. During the first week, someone left a note on her locker suggesting she should quit and let a real soldier take her spot. Sarah crumpled the note and threw it away without telling anyone. The initial training covered basic flight principles and helicopter operations. Sarah excelled at the classroom work, absorbing technical information like a sponge. When they moved to actual flight training in the TH-67 trainer helicopter, she discovered she had a natural feel for the controls. Her instructor noted that she had exceptional spatial awareness and smooth control inputs. While other students struggled with hovering, Sarah made it look effortless. Her success didn't win her any friends among the male students who resented her presence. One afternoon after a particularly good training flight, Sarah overheard two of her classmates talking in the locker room. They didn't know she was there, or maybe they didn't care. One of them said that women didn't have the physical strength to handle a combat helicopter in an emergency. The other agreed, adding that when things got real in combat, female pilots would crack under pressure. Sarah stood quietly in the adjoining room, her hands clenched into fists. She wanted to confront them, to defend herself and every other woman who had worked hard to be there. Instead, she took a deep breath and made a silent promise to herself. She would prove them wrong through her actions, not her words. The next phase of training involved learning to fly the Apache helicopter specifically. The AH-64 Apache was one of the most sophisticated attack helicopters in the world. It bristled with weapons, including a 30 chain gun, Hellfire missiles, and rocket pods. The helicopter could detect and engage targets from miles away using advanced sensors and targeting systems. It was heavily armored and could sustain significant damage while still flying. Learning to operate all of these systems simultaneously while flying the helicopter required intense focus and coordination. Sarah's first time in an Apache cockpit was overwhelming. The pilot sat in the rear seat with a full set of flight controls, while the co-pilot gunner sat in the front seat below and ahead of the pilot. Each position had different responsibilities and different displays. Sarah's instructor guided her through the startup procedures, and she was amazed at how complex the helicopter was compared to the trainer. There were hundreds of switches, buttons, and displays. The rotor noise was deafening even through her helmet. When they finally lifted off, Sarah felt the raw power of the machine. This was not a gentle trainer helicopter. This was a weapon system that weighed over 10,000 pounds and could destroy tanks from miles away. Her instructor was a warrant officer named Mike who had 2 combat tours in Iraq. He was tough but fair, and he seemed to judge Sarah purely on her abilities. During one training flight, they practiced engagement maneuvers against simulated ground targets. Sarah had to coordinate between flying the helicopter, managing the weapons systems, and communicating with her co-pilot gunner. It was mentally exhausting, like trying to play chess, fly an airplane, and have a conversation all at the same time. When they landed, told her she had good instincts but needed to work on her target prioritization. Sarah spent every spare moment studying. She reviewed gun camera footage from combat operations to understand how experienced pilots made decisions. She practiced emergency procedures in the simulator until she could respond without thinking. She memorized the capabilities and limitations of enemy weapons systems. Other students went out drinking on weekends. Sarah stayed in her room and studied. Her dedication started to earn grudging respect from some of her classmates, though others continued to resent her. The weapons qualification course was where Sarah truly began to shine. This phase involved actually firing the Apache's weapons at training ranges. The first time Sarah fired the 30 chain gun, the recoil shook the entire helicopter. spent shell casings ejected from the side, glinting in the sunlight as they fell toward the ground. She watched through her targeting display as the rounds impacted the target area, kicking up dirt and shredding the practice target. The power was intoxicating. She moved on to rockets, unleashing volleys that streaked toward the ground, trailing smoke. Finally, she fired a Hellfire missile, watching it guide precisely to the designated target and explode with devastating effect. Her gunnery scores were exceptional. Sarah had always been good with spatial relationships and calculations, and those skills translated perfectly to weapons employment. She could estimate range and lead angles intuitively. Her instructors noted that she had a particular talent for engaging moving targets. During one exercise, she successfully engaged a series of moving vehicle targets while flying at high speed and low altitude. It was considered one of the most difficult scenarios, and Sarah executed it nearly perfectly. Even the students who disliked her had to acknowledge her skill. As graduation from flight school approached, Sarah requested assignment to a combat aviation brigade. This was the moment of truth. She had proven she could fly and fight, but would the Army actually send her to a unit preparing for deployment? Some of her female classmates were being assigned to training units or support roles, positions where they would never see combat. Sarah wanted to be where the action was. She wanted the chance to prove that women could perform in combat aviation roles just as well as men. Her orders came through assigning her to the 1st Battalion, 227th Aviation Regiment, part of the 1st Cavalry Division at Fort Hood, Texas. The unit had recently returned from Afghanistan and was preparing for another deployment, this time to an undisclosed location in the Middle East. Sarah was thrilled and terrified at the same time. This was what she had worked for, but now it was actually happening. She would be going to war. Fort Hood in Texas was massive, one of the largest military installations in the world. Sarah arrived on a scorching summer day, the heat radiating off the pavement in visible waves. She reported to her unit and met her battalion commander, a lieutenant colonel named James. He looked at her personnel file and then looked at her, his expression unreadable. He told her that she would be assigned to Bravo Company and that he expected every pilot in his battalion to perform at the highest level regardless of gender. Sarah assured him she would not let him down. Her company commander was a captain named David, a veteran of multiple deployments. He was more openly skeptical about having a female pilot in his unit. During their first meeting, he told Sarah that combat aviation was unforgiving and that there was no room for weakness. He said he would be watching her performance closely. Sarah understood the subtext. She would have to work harder and perform better than the male pilots just to be considered equal. It wasn't fair, but she had expected it. The unit was in the middle of pre-deployment training when Sarah arrived. They were practicing formation flying, tactical approaches, and coordinated engagements. Sarah was paired with a co-pilot gunner named Jason Walker, a specialist with one previous deployment. Jason was professional but distant at first. He had heard that a female pilot was joining the unit, and he wasn't sure what to expect. Their first few flights together were awkward as they learned each other's communication styles and habits. During a training exercise in their second week together, They were practicing a tactical movement to contact scenario. Sarah was flying low and fast across the training area when they received simulated enemy fire from multiple positions. She immediately took evasive action, jinking the helicopter and using terrain masking to break the enemy's line of sight. Jason called out targets, and Sarah positioned the helicopter for engagement. They worked through the scenario smoothly, destroying the simulated threats and completing the mission. When they landed, Jason told her it was good flying. It was the first compliment he had given her, and Sarah felt like she had crossed an important threshold. The battalion's deployment orders finally came through. They would be heading to a forward operating base in a contested region where coalition forces were supporting local allied troops against insurgent groups. The area was known for heavy fighting and frequent attacks. Sarah's platoon would be providing close air support and armed reconnaissance for ground forces. The mission was exactly what she had trained for, but the reality of it was sobering. This wasn't a training exercise. The people would be trying to kill her, and she would be trying to kill them. The pre-deployment preparation intensified. Sarah reviewed intelligence reports about the area of operations, studying maps and threat assessments. The enemy forces were well-armed and experienced. They had access to heavy machine guns, rocket-propelled grenades, and portable surface-to-air missiles. They knew how to use terrain to their advantage and had developed tactics specifically to counter-attack helicopters. Sarah absorbed all of this information, trying to prepare mentally for what was coming. She called her parents the week before deployment. Her mother cried, trying to hide it but failing. Her father told her to be safe and that they were proud of her. Sarah wanted to reassure them that she would be fine, but she couldn't make that promise. Combat aviation was dangerous, and people died. She told them she loved them and that she would write when she could. The conversation left her feeling melancholy for days. The flight to the deployment location involved multiple legs with stops for refueling. Sarah and her unit traveled in a large military transport aircraft, sitting in uncomfortable seats surrounded by gear and equipment. The other pilots talked and joked, but Sarah mostly stayed quiet, lost in her own thoughts. She wondered if she was really ready for this. All the training in the world couldn't fully prepare someone for the reality of combat. She would find out soon enough if she had what it took. They landed at the forward operating base in the middle of the night. The base was a sprawling collection of hardened structures, tents, and protective barriers. Guard towers overlooked the perimeter, and the sound of generators hummed constantly in the background. Sarah and the other new arrivals were briefed on the base procedures and security protocols. The threat of rocket and mortar attacks was constant, and the first rays of sunlight cut through the dusty air as Sarah walked across the base toward the flight line. The Apache helicopters sat in reinforced shelters, their weapons loaded and ready. The ground crews were already at work performing pre-flight inspections and servicing the aircraft. Sarah approached her assigned helicopter and began her own inspection, running through the checklist methodically. Jason joined her a few minutes later, carrying his flight gear and looking tired. They had been woken at 4 in the morning for their first combat mission. The briefing had been thorough but unsettling. Coalition ground forces were conducting an operation to clear an enemy stronghold about 40 miles from the base. Intelligence indicated the enemy had significant forces in the area, including armored vehicles and fortified positions. Sarah's Apache, along with 3 others from her company, would provide overwatch and close air support. Their call sign was Viper 24, and they would be working directly with a forward air controller embedded with the ground troops. As Sarah strapped into the pilot's seat, her hands were steady despite the nervous energy coursing through her body. This was it. Everything she had trained for had led to this moment. She went through the startup procedures with practiced precision, the turbine engines spooling up with their distinctive whine. The radio came alive with chatter as other aircraft checked in and coordinated their departure. Sarah listened carefully, building a mental picture of where everyone was positioned. The flight to the area of operations took 30 minutes. They flew in a tactical formation, maintaining separation while staying close enough to support each other. Sarah kept the Apache low, using the terrain to mask their approach. The landscape below was a mix of desert and sparse vegetation, with occasional villages and road networks. She could see civilian vehicles on some of the roads, people going about their daily lives while a battle was about to unfold nearby. The ground controller's voice came through her headset, calm and professional. The friendly forces were about to begin their assault on the enemy position. He provided Sarah with the locations of friendly troops and the suspected enemy positions. Sarah marked everything on her digital map display, making sure she understood the battlefield layout. The last thing she wanted was to engage the wrong target in the confusion of combat. Jason spotted the first enemy position through the Apache's targeting system. It was a fortified bunker on a hilltop overlooking the ground forces' approach route. He designated the target and Sarah maneuvered the helicopter into an engagement position. Her heart was pounding, but her hands on the controls were smooth. Jason fired a Hellfire missile, and they watched it streak toward the target, guiding precisely to impact. The explosion was clearly visible even from miles away, the bunker disappearing in a cloud of dust and debris. The ground forces began their advance, and almost immediately they took fire from multiple positions. The enemy had prepared the battlefield well, with interlocking fields of fire and concealed fighting positions. Sarah and the other Apache went to work, systematically destroying enemy positions as the ground controller directed them. Sarah found herself falling into a rhythm. Jason would identify and designate targets. Sarah would maneuver the helicopter and manage the flight profile, and together they would employ weapons. It was exactly like the training exercises, except the explosions were real and people were dying. An enemy technical vehicle, a pickup truck with a heavy machine gun mounted in the bed, appeared on a road behind the friendly forces. It was trying to flank them and attack from an unexpected direction. Jason called it out immediately, and Sarah banked the Apache hard, bringing the nose around to engage. She activated the 30 chain gun and Jason aimed using the helmet-mounted sight. The gun roared to life, and Sarah watched as the rounds walked across the ground toward the target. The technical vehicle was torn apart, ammunition cooking off in secondary explosions. The battle continued for hours. Sarah's initial nervousness faded, replaced by intense focus. She was too busy to be scared, processing information from multiple sources and making split-second decisions. The other Apache in her flight were performing well, working together to support the ground forces. Whenever one helicopter had to break off to rearm or refuel, the others would adjust their positions to maintain coverage. It was a carefully choreographed dance of violence and teamwork. During one particularly intense engagement, an enemy rocket-propelled grenade streaked past Sarah's helicopter, missing by what seemed like inches. The proximity alert screamed in her headset, and she immediately broke hard to the left, diving toward the ground to throw off any follow-up shots. Her stomach lurched with the violent maneuver, but she kept control of the aircraft. Jason called out that he had spotted the launch position, and Sarah brought the helicopter back around for a firing run. They destroyed the enemy position with rockets, ensuring that threat was eliminated. The ground forces successfully cleared the enemy stronghold by late afternoon. The final tally was devastating for the enemy. They had lost dozens of fighters and most of their heavy weapons. The coalition forces had suffered only minor casualties, largely thanks to the Apache support. As Sarah flew back to base, she felt exhausted but also exhilarated. She had done it. Her first combat mission was a success, and she had performed exactly as trained. The debriefing back at base was detailed and professional. The mission commander praised the aviation support, noting that it had been critical to the operation's success. Captain, Sarah's company commander, acknowledged that she had done good work. It wasn't effusive praise, but coming from him it meant something. The other pilots in her unit seemed to view her differently now. She had proven herself in actual combat, and that carried weight that no amount of training could match. Over the following weeks, Sarah flew mission after mission. Some were intense combat operations like her first mission. Others were reconnaissance patrols where they spent hours observing enemy movements and reporting intelligence. She learned to deal with the physical exhaustion of long flights in full combat gear. She learned to manage the stress of knowing that every mission could be her last. She learned to compartmentalize the violence she was participating in, focusing on the mission rather than dwelling on the destruction she was causing. Jason had become more than just her co-pilot. They developed the kind of trust that only comes from facing danger together repeatedly. They could anticipate each other's actions and communicate with minimal words. In combat, when seconds mattered, that kind of partnership was invaluable. Jason told her one evening that he had been skeptical about flying with a female pilot, but that she had proven herself to be one of the best pilots in the unit. Sarah appreciated the honesty and the compliment. Not everyone in the unit was as accepting. There were still a few pilots who made snide comments or questioned whether Sarah's presence was a distraction. One warrant officer named Brad Mitchell was particularly vocal. He complained that the Army was more concerned with political correctness than combat effectiveness. Sarah ignored him as much as possible, but his attitude bothered her. She had proven herself repeatedly, yet some people were determined to see her presence as a problem rather than an asset. The situation came to a head during a mission planning session. They were preparing for a major operation, and Brad suggested that Sarah should be assigned to a less critical role. He claimed it was because she had less experience than some other pilots, but everyone in the room knew what he really meant. Captain shut him down immediately, stating that Sarah had proven herself to be an excellent pilot and would be assigned based on capability, not gender. Brad backed off, but Sarah could see the resentment in his eyes. That night, Sarah lay in her bunk thinking about the constant need to prove herself. She was tired of it. She had flown dozens of combat missions successfully. She had destroyed enemy positions and saved friendly lives. Yet there were still people who saw her as a diversity checkbox rather than a combat pilot. She wondered if it would ever change, or if she would spend her entire career fighting this battle alongside the actual war. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Intelligence had identified a major enemy armored column moving toward a key strategic location. The enemy had apparently acquired a significant number of tanks and armored personnel carriers from unknown sources. They were planning a massive assault that could potentially overrun Allied positions if not stopped. The battalion was tasked with interdicting the enemy column before it could reach its objective. Every available Apache would be involved in the operation. The mission briefing was sobering. The enemy column consisted of approximately 50 armored vehicles spread over several miles of road. They would be protected by air defense systems and infantry with shoulder-fired missiles. The Apache would have to engage at extended ranges to avoid the air defenses, using their Hellfire missiles and rockets to destroy as many vehicles as possible. It would be the largest engagement the battalion had participated in during this deployment. Sarah and Jason prepared their helicopter meticulously. They loaded maximum weapons, including 16 Hellfire missiles and 76 rockets, along with a full load of 30 ammunition. The helicopter was heavy with all the ordnance, and Sarah knew she would need to be careful with her energy management during the mission. A heavily loaded Apache didn't have the same performance margins as a lighter one. The attack was planned for dawn, catching the enemy column as it moved through a valley with limited escape routes. 8 Apache from the battalion would participate, attacking from multiple directions simultaneously to overwhelm the enemy's defenses. Sarah's flight of 4 helicopters would attack from the north, engaging the front of the column. Another flight would attack from the south, hitting the rear. The goal was to trap the column and destroy it completely. They launched in darkness, flying with night vision goggles to avoid detection. Sarah found the night flying to be easier than she had expected. The landscape was visible in shades of green through her goggles, and the Apache's terrain avoidance systems helped her maintain safe altitude. They flew low and fast, the desert terrain passing beneath them in a blur. Radio communication was kept to minimum to maintain operational security. The tension in the cockpit was palpable. As they approached the target area, dawn was just beginning to break. Sarah could see the enemy column in the valley below, dozens of vehicles moving in a long line. They didn't know the Apache were there. The element of surprise was total. The mission commander gave the order to engage, and Sarah's flight began their attack run. Jason designated targets rapidly, prioritizing the tanks as the most dangerous threats. Sarah positioned the helicopter for optimal weapons employment while staying at maximum range from the column. The first Hellfire missiles launched, streaking toward their targets with deadly accuracy. Sarah watched as the first tank exploded, its turret blown completely off by the missile's impact. Then another and another. The sky filled with missiles as all four Apache in her flight engaged simultaneously. The enemy column erupted in chaos. Vehicles tried to disperse, but they were trapped in the valley with limited room to maneuver. Some tanks tried to return fire, their guns elevating toward the helicopters, but the Apache were too far away and too maneuverable. Sarah fired her entire load of Hellfire missiles in quick succession, Jason designating new targets as fast as she could engage them. Every missile found its mark, each one destroying an enemy vehicle. When her Hellfires were expended, Sarah transitioned to rockets. She flew along the length of the column, unleashing volleys of rockets that tore into the lighter armored vehicles. The destruction was total and overwhelming. The valley floor was covered in burning vehicles and secondary explosions as ammunition and fuel cooked off. The other Apache flight attacked from the opposite direction, and the enemy column simply ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Sarah pulled away from the target area, her helicopter now much lighter with all weapons expended. She took stock of the situation. All 8 Apache had survived the engagement without damage. The enemy column was completely destroyed. It had been a perfect execution of coordinated attack helicopter tactics. Sarah felt a mixture of pride and horror at the destruction they had unleashed. This was the reality of combat aviation. She was good at killing, and that was both satisfying and disturbing. The flight back to base was quiet. Everyone was processing what had just happened. They had just participated in one of the most significant attack helicopter engagements in recent history. The after-action reports would study this mission for years to come. As they landed and shut down the helicopters, Sarah realized her hands were shaking slightly. The adrenaline was wearing off, and the full weight of what they had done was settling in. The battalion commander personally congratulated the crews. He told them they had stopped a major enemy offensive and likely saved hundreds of friendly lives. The ground forces that would have faced that armored column were grateful to still be alive. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility that came with that knowledge. Her actions had consequences that rippled far beyond just her own experience. She had helped change the outcome of a battle, maybe even the trajectory of the larger war. Everyone was required to know the location of the nearest bunker at all T-word of the successful mission, spread quickly throughout the coalition forces. Sarah found herself receiving congratulations from people she had never met before. Officers from other units stopped her to shake her hand. The battalion public affairs officer wanted to interview her for a story about the engagement. Sarah declined, uncomfortable with the attention. She was just doing her job the same as every other pilot in her unit. The fact that she was a woman shouldn't make it more newsworthy. Captain called her into his office 3 days after the mission. Sarah expected another briefing or perhaps a new assignment. Instead, he told her to sit down and then did something unexpected. He apologized. He admitted that he had doubted whether a female pilot could handle the pressures of combat aviation. He had been wrong, and he wanted her to know that she had earned his complete respect. Sarah was momentarily speechless. Captain was not a man given to emotional displays or easy admissions of error. His apology meant more to her than all the congratulations from strangers. The enemy forces in the region had been dealt a severe blow, but they were not defeated. Intelligence reports indicated they were regrouping and planning retaliatory attacks. The coalition forces remained on high alert, and the Apache crews maintained a rapid response posture. Sarah and Jason flew patrol missions almost daily, watching for signs of enemy activity and responding to calls for support from ground units. During one patrol mission, they received an urgent call from a ground unit under attack. A coalition patrol had been ambushed in a village about 20 minutes from Sarah's position. They were taking heavy fire from multiple positions and had casualties. Other aircraft were too far away to respond in time. Sarah and Jason were the only available support. Sarah pushed the Apache to maximum speed, racing toward the besieged patrol. As they approached the village, Jason could see the situation through the targeting system. The friendly forces were pinned down in a plaza, surrounded by buildings occupied by enemy fighters. The enemy had them in a kill zone, firing from elevated positions with a clear view of the trapped soldiers. Sarah needed to provide immediate suppression fire to break the enemy's advantage, but the situation was complicated by the urban terrain. The friendly troops were dangerously close to the enemy positions, and there were likely civilians in some of the buildings. Sarah made a split-second decision. She would fly directly over the village at low altitude, using the Apache's 30 gun to suppress the enemy positions while minimizing the risk to friendlies and civilians. It was a dangerous maneuver, exposing her helicopter to enemy fire from multiple directions, but it was the fastest way to give the ground troops a chance to escape. She dove toward the village, the helicopter screaming in at over 120 knots. Jason called out targets as they flashed past, and Sarah engaged with short, precise bursts from the chain gun. The sound was deafening even through her helmet. Tracer fire reached up toward them from the ground, enemy fighters shooting at the Apache with everything they had. The proximity alerts were going crazy, warning of multiple threats. Sarah jinked and weaved, making the helicopter as difficult a target as possible while maintaining her gun runs. She could see the friendly troops below using the suppression fire to break contact and move to a more defensible position. A rocket-propelled grenade exploded just behind the helicopter, close enough that Sarah felt the concussion through the airframe. Warning lights illuminated on her instrument panel. They had taken damage, but the helicopter was still flying. She continued her attack runs, refusing to break off while the friendly troops were still in danger. Jason was magnificent in the co-pilot's seat, designating targets and managing the weapons system while keeping track of the friendly troop positions. They worked together with perfect synchronization, each trusting the other completely. After what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes, the ground commander reported that his unit had successfully broken contact and was moving to a safe extraction point. Sarah pulled away from the village, climbing to a safer altitude. Now that the immediate crisis was over, she assessed the damage to her helicopter. They had taken several hits from small arms fire. Most had been stopped by the Apache's armor, but one round had damaged a hydraulic line. The system was showing reduced pressure, and Sarah knew they needed to get back to base quickly before the damage got worse. The flight back was tense. Sarah carefully monitored the helicopter's systems, ready to perform an emergency landing if necessary. Jason coordinated with the base to have maintenance crews standing by. They made it back without further incident, landing the damaged helicopter gently on the pad. As Sarah shut down the systems, she noticed her hands were shaking again. The danger had been more acute this time, more personal. They had been hit, and it could have been much worse. The maintenance crews swarmed over the helicopter, assessing the damage. In addition to the hydraulic line, they found bullet impacts on the tail boom, one of the landing gear struts, and several on the armored cockpit. One round had struck just inches from Sarah's seat. If it had been a few inches to the left, it would have hit her. The maintenance chief told her she was lucky. Sarah nodded, feeling the truth of that statement in her bones. The ground unit commander that Sarah had rescued visited her the next day. He was a captain named, and he brought his entire squad with him. They wanted to thank the Apache crew that had saved their lives, told Sarah that they had been certain they were going to die in that village. The enemy had them completely surrounded and was closing in for the kill. Then Sarah's Apache had appeared like an avenging angel, and everything changed. His men had made it out with only minor injuries because of her actions. Sarah was deeply moved by their gratitude. It reminded her of why she had wanted to become a combat pilot in the first place. It wasn't about the machines or the weapons or even the flying itself. It was about protecting people, about making a difference in life-or-death situations. Asked for a photo with Sarah and Jason, and they agreed. The photo would later circulate widely, becoming one of the iconic images of female combat pilots in action. The battalion commander nominated Sarah for a Distinguished Flying Cross for her actions during the village rescue. It was a significant award, one of the highest decorations for heroism in aerial combat. Sarah was uncomfortable with the recognition, feeling like she had just done what any pilot would do in the same situation. But Captain told her that accepting recognition was part of her responsibility. Other women would follow in her path, and seeing women receive awards for combat valor helped to normalize their presence in these roles. Brad Mitchell, the warrant officer who had consistently doubted Sarah's abilities, approached her after a mission briefing one morning. Sarah expected another confrontation or snide comment. Instead, Brad told her that he had been wrong about her. He had let his prejudices cloud his judgment, and he was man enough to admit it. He said she was a damn fine pilot and that he would be honored to fly as her wingman any time. Sarah accepted his apology, recognizing how difficult it must have been for him to give it. The deployment continued through the summer and into fall. Sarah flew more than 100 combat missions, accumulating hundreds of flight hours in the Apache. She became one of the most experienced and skilled pilots in the battalion. Younger pilots sought her advice, and she found herself taking on an informal mentorship role. She remembered how alone she had felt during her training, and she made sure that other pilots, especially the women, knew they had someone to turn to. 2 more female pilots joined the unit during the deployment. Sarah made it a point to welcome them and help them integrate into the team. She told them about her own experiences and challenges, but also emphasized that they needed to prove themselves through their performance. Gender might make the path harder, but it didn't determine the outcome. Their skills and dedication would define their careers. One of these new pilots was a lieutenant named Jessica. She was bright and eager, but also nervous about how she would be received. Sarah took her under her wing, flying several missions together and providing guidance. She told Jessica that there would be people who doubted her, but that the best response was always to perform exceptionally well. Words were cheap, but actions spoke volumes. Jessica absorbed the advice gratefully, and Sarah felt satisfaction in passing along what she had learned. The war was evolving. The enemy had been pushed back from their previous positions, but they adapted their tactics. They began using more improvised explosive devices and ambush tactics, avoiding the kind of large-scale confrontations where coalition air power could be decisive. The Apache missions shifted accordingly, focusing more on armed reconnaissance and convoy security. It was still dangerous work, but different from the intense combat of the deployment's earlier months. Sarah's relationship with her family back home was sustained through occasional phone calls and emails. Her mother still worried constantly, and Sarah tried to reassure her without revealing how dangerous some of the missions really were. Her father wanted to hear about the flying and the Apaches' capabilities. He was proud of her accomplishments, even though he didn't fully understand the world she now inhabited. Sarah treasured these connections to her previous life, even as she became more deeply embedded in the military culture. The deployment was scheduled to last 12 months, and as they approached the 9-month mark, everyone began thinking about home. The battalion had performed exceptionally well, and casualties had been mercifully light. Sarah had lost count of how many combat missions she had flown. Each one blurred together in her memory, a montage of adrenaline and focus and exhaustion. She was proud of what she and her unit had accomplished, but she was also ready to leave this place and return to a world where people weren't trying to kill her every day. During a mission in the 10th month of deployment, Sarah had an experience that would haunt her. They were providing overwatch for a ground patrol when they spotted a vehicle approaching the patrol at high speed. Based on the behavior and intelligence reports about vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices in the area, the ground commander designated it as a threat and requested Sarah engage. She fired a Hellfire missile, destroying the vehicle in a massive explosion. Later analysis revealed that the vehicle had not been carrying explosives. It had been a civilian driving erratically because he was rushing his pregnant wife to a hospital. Both had been killed in the missile strike. Sarah was devastated. The rules of engagement had been followed correctly, and the tactical decision had been sound based on available information, but 2 innocent people were dead because of her actions. The battalion commander told her it was the tragic reality of warfare, that mistakes happened even with the best intentions and procedures. Sarah struggled with the guilt and the weight of that mistake. She talked with the battalion chaplain, trying to process the moral complexity of what she did. The chaplain reminded her that she had also saved numerous lives through her actions. The soldiers in Captain's unit were alive because of her. The enemy armored column had been stopped before it could kill coalition forces and civilians. War was filled with impossible choices and tragic outcomes. The key was to learn from mistakes and continue striving to minimize harm while accomplishing necessary missions. Jason helped her work through it as well. He reminded her that they were fighting against an enemy that deliberately targeted civilians and used terror tactics. The coalition forces went to great lengths to avoid civilian casualties, but perfection was impossible in the chaos of combat. Sarah appreciated his support, even as she continued to carry the burden of that mistake. She promised herself that she would be even more careful in the future, that she would question and verify before engaging whenever possible. The final months of the deployment were relatively quiet. The enemy had been significantly weakened, and coalition forces were consolidating their gains. Sarah flew fewer combat missions and more routine patrols. The pace was slower, but everyone remained alert. Complacency at the end of a deployment was dangerous, and there were still threats that could kill the unwary. Sarah maintained her focus and discipline, refusing to let her guard down until they were safely back home. The award ceremony was held at the forward operating base 2 weeks before they were scheduled to leave. Sarah received her Distinguished Flying Cross in front of the assembled battalion. The citation detailed her actions during the village rescue, describing how she had repeatedly exposed herself to enemy fire to protect trapped friendly forces. The battalion commander pinned the medal to her uniform, and everyone applauded. Sarah felt pride and humility in equal measure. She thought about all the people who had supported her journey, from her parents to her instructors to Captain and Jason. As the deployment wound down, Sarah reflected on how much she had changed. She had arrived as a newly qualified pilot eager to prove herself. She was leaving as a combat veteran with extensive experience and hard-won wisdom. She had proven that women could excel in combat aviation roles, but more importantly, she had proven it to herself. The external validation was nice, but the internal confidence was what really mattered. The flight home was long and tedious, but no one complained. They were going home. The landscape of Montana had never looked more beautiful to Sarah as she drove through the mountains toward her. The deployment had ended 2 weeks earlier, and after processing back at Fort Hood, she had taken her full month of post-deployment leave. Her parents had insisted she come home, and Sarah hadn't resisted. She needed the peace and normalcy that only home could provide. The mountains, the clean air, the absence of helicopters and weapons, it all felt like a different world compared to the desert war zone she had left behind. Her parents had aged in the year she had been gone. Her father's hair had more gray, and her mother's face showed new lines of worry. They hugged her tightly at the door, and Sarah saw tears in her mother's eyes. They had prepared her favorite meals and decorated the house with welcome home signs. It was overwhelming and comforting at the same time. Sarah had spent so long being strong and professional that it felt strange to be vulnerable and emotional with her family. The first few days were difficult. Sarah found herself waking up at odd hours, her sleep schedule still adjusted to the deployment cycle. She would lie awake thinking about missions and remembering the faces of people she had seen through her targeting system. The transition from combat to civilian life was harder than she had anticipated. Everything felt too safe, too normal. She caught herself constantly assessing her surroundings for threats that didn't exist. Her father, with his experience around veterans from his time at the airport, recognized the signs. He didn't push Sarah to talk, but he made sure she knew he was available if she needed to. They spent time together working on a restoration project for an old helicopter tail rotor he had acquired. The mechanical work was therapeutic, requiring focus but not emotional energy. Sarah found that working with her hands helped quiet the thoughts that churned constantly in her mind. The town's reaction to Sarah's return was mixed. Some people treated her like a hero, thanking her for her service and asking about her experiences. Sarah appreciated their gratitude, but found it difficult to talk about combat with people who had no frame of reference. How could she explain what it was like to fire missiles at human beings? How could she describe the weight of command decisions made in split seconds? Other people seemed uncomfortable around her, as if they didn't know how to reconcile the girl they remembered with the combat veteran she had become. Sarah gave a talk at her old high school at the principal's request. She stood before an auditorium full of students and talked about her journey from that very school to combat aviation. She emphasized the importance of education and dedication. She told them that barriers and doubts from others were inevitable, but that persistence and competence would eventually win out. Several young women approached her afterward, saying they had been inspired by her story. Sarah felt a sense of responsibility to these potential future aviators. Her success or failure would influence whether they pursued similar paths. The month of leave passed quickly. Sarah reconnected with old friends, though she found that they had less in common than before. While she had been at war, they had been living normal lives with normal concerns. She couldn't relate to their complaints about jobs or relationships when she had been making life-and-death decisions a few weeks earlier. She felt isolated even among people who cared about her. This was a cost of military service that no one had really explained to her during training. Returning to Fort Hood felt like coming back to a place where she truly belonged. Her unit had reintegrated successfully, and the Apache crews were back to their regular training cycles. The combat deployment had bonded them together, and there was a sense of camaraderie that transcended the earlier divisions about gender. Sarah was now fully accepted as one of the team, her abilities and courage proven beyond any doubt. She was promoted to captain and given a new assignment as a flight platoon leader. This meant she would be responsible for 4 Apache crews, overseeing their training and readiness. It was a leadership position with significant responsibility. Sarah threw herself into the role, determined to build her platoon into the best in the battalion. She emphasized technical proficiency and tactical innovation, pushing her pilots to constantly improve their skills. Jessica was assigned to Sarah's platoon, and Sarah was pleased to continue mentoring the younger pilot. Jessica had performed well during the deployment and was developing into a strong aviator. Sarah shared the lessons she had learned, both the tactical knowledge and the interpersonal wisdom about navigating military culture as a woman. Jessica absorbed everything eagerly, and Sarah saw in her a reflection of her own earlier enthusiasm and determination. The battalion began preparing for another deployment, this time to a different region with different challenges. Sarah helped develop training scenarios based on their previous deployment experiences. She worked with the intelligence section to understand the new area of operations and the threats they would face. The preparation was thorough and professional, leveraging the hard-won knowledge from combat experience. During this training cycle, Sarah was selected to attend the captain's career course, an advanced professional development program for Army officers. The course lasted several months and covered everything from tactics to leadership to operational planning. Sarah excelled in the academic environment, her combat experience giving her credibility and perspective that purely theoretical students lacked. She networked with officers from other branches and units, building relationships that would serve her throughout her career. One of her instructors at the career course was a colonel named Hayes, one of the most senior female officers in Army aviation. Colonel Hayes had been a pioneer in her own right, flying helicopters at a time when even fewer women were in combat aviation roles. She took an interest in Sarah's career and became an informal mentor. They had several long conversations about leadership, career progression, and the unique challenges faced by women in the military. Colonel Hayes told Sarah that she had the potential to rise to senior leadership positions, but that the path would not be easy. Every promotion would be scrutinized more carefully. Every mistake would be. Sarah would need to be not just good, but exceptional at every stage of her career. It was an unfair standard compared to male officers, but it was the reality. Colonel Hayes encouraged Sarah to seek out challenging assignments and to never be satisfied with just meeting expectations. Excellence was the only path forward for women who wanted to break into the highest ranks. Sarah took this advice to heart. When she returned to her unit after the career course, she volunteered for additional duties and sought out opportunities to broaden her experience. She became the battalion's standardization instructor pilot, responsible for ensuring all pilots maintained proficiency in critical skills. She wrote training publications and developed new tactics based on combat lessons learned. She made herself indispensable to the battalion's success. The second deployment came 18 months after returning from the first. This time they were going to support operations in a mountainous region where the terrain and weather posed significant challenges. The enemy in this area was sophisticated and experienced, using the terrain to their advantage. They had portable air defense systems and had developed tactics specifically to counter-attack helicopters. It would be a different kind of war than Sarah's first deployment. The forward operating base in the mountains was smaller and more austere than the previous one. The weather was dramatically different, with cold temperatures and frequent storms. Sarah found that flying in the mountains required different techniques and considerations than the desert operations she was experienced with. The thin air at high altitude affected helicopter performance, and the terrain made navigation more complex. She studied mountain flying operations intensively and practiced the specialized maneuvers required. Her platoon was assigned to support Special Operations Forces conducting raids against high-value enemy targets. These missions required precision timing and coordination. The margin for error was minimal. Sarah worked closely with the Special Operations commanders, building trust and understanding their requirements. She made sure her pilots were prepared for the unique demands of supporting special operations, including operating at night in difficult terrain. The first special operations mission came 3 weeks into the deployment. The target was an enemy commander's compound high in the mountains. Sarah's platoon would provide overwatch and fire support for the assault force. They launched at midnight, flying through mountain passes using night vision systems. The terrain was treacherous, with peaks rising on both sides and unpredictable winds that buffeted the helicopters. Sarah led from the front, demonstrating the techniques and building her pilot's confidence. The assault went perfectly. Sarah's Apache took up positions overlooking the compound, sensors scanning for threats. When the assault force landed and breached the compound, they immediately took fire from enemy fighters in surrounding buildings. Sarah coordinated the response, directing her pilots to suppress the enemy positions while avoiding any risk to the friendly forces below. They fired with surgical precision, the 30 gun and rockets destroying enemy positions one by one. The Special Operations Forces completed their mission with no casualties, capturing the enemy commander and valuable intelligence. The Special Operations commanders were impressed with Sarah's platoon's performance. They requested to work with her unit exclusively for future missions. This was high praise in the Special Operations community, which had exacting standards and little patience for substandard performance. Sarah's platoon conducted mission after mission with the Special Operations Forces, building a reputation for reliability and precision. The bond between the aviators and the ground force operators was strong, forged through shared danger and mutual respect. During one mission, Sarah's platoon was supporting a raid on an enemy weapons cache when things went wrong. The assault force encountered much heavier resistance than expected, and one of their helicopters was hit by enemy fire during insertion. The pilot managed to control the damaged helicopter and landed away from the immediate fighting, but now the crew was stranded in enemy territory with a disabled aircraft. Sarah immediately diverted her Apache to provide cover for the downed crew. She arrived over the crash site to find the crew taking fire from multiple directions. Enemy fighters were moving toward their position, trying to capture or kill them before they could be rescued. Sarah engaged the advancing enemy forces aggressively, using every weapon at her disposal to keep them away from the downed crew. Other helicopters were inbound to attempt a rescue, but it would take time for them to arrive. Sarah had to hold the enemy off alone. The fight was intense. Enemy fighters were using buildings and terrain for cover, making them difficult targets. Sarah had to get close to engage effectively, which exposed her helicopter to ground fire. She took several hits, but the Apache's armor held. She maneuvered constantly, never staying in one position long enough for the enemy to draw a bead on her. Jason in the co-pilot seat was working miracles with the weapons system, designating targets faster than seemed humanly possible. Together, they created a protective bubble around the downed crew. A rescue helicopter finally arrived, flying in fast and low. Sarah provided covering fire as it landed and picked up the downed crew. The rescue helicopter took off with the rescued crew aboard, and Sarah stayed in position to cover their escape. Only when she was certain they were clear did she break off and head for base. Her Apache was low on fuel and ammunition, the instruments showing warning lights from combat damage. She had pushed the helicopter and herself to the limit, but everyone had made it out alive. The Special Operations Commander personally thanked Sarah after the mission. He told her that her actions had saved his crew and that she had the gratitude of the entire Special Operations community. He recommended her for a Silver Star, one of the military's highest awards for valor. Sarah was humbled by the recognition, but also troubled by how close they had come to losing people. Every mission carried risk, and sometimes even perfect execution couldn't eliminate the danger. The deployment continued through winter and into spring. Sarah's platoon flew in snow, ice, and conditions that would have grounded less capable units. They mastered mountain flying and became experts in the specialized tactics required for the terrain. Sarah mentored her pilots constantly, sharing knowledge and building their skills. She took particular care with Jessica, who was developing into an outstanding pilot in her own right. Sarah saw Jessica as proof that the path she had helped forge was becoming more accessible for the women who followed. Near the end of the deployment, Sarah received news that shocked her. She had been selected for promotion to major, a rank that would qualify her for staff and command positions at higher levels of the Army. More significantly, she had been selected to attend the Army's Command and General Staff College, an intermediate leadership course for officers identified as having high potential. This was a clear signal that senior leadership saw her as someone who could rise to the highest ranks of the military. Captain, who had been promoted to major himself and was now the battalion operations officer, congratulated her on the news. He told Sarah that she had come a long way from the uncertain lieutenant he had first met. She had proven herself to be an exceptional officer and pilot. He predicted that she would someday command an aviation battalion and possibly rise even higher. Sarah appreciated his confidence, even as she felt the weight of those expectations. The final weeks of the deployment were spent preparing to transfer responsibilities to the unit that would replace them. Sarah made sure all the lessons learned were documented and passed along. She briefed the incoming platoon leaders on the tactics that worked and the challenges they would face. The continuity of institutional knowledge was important, and Sarah took the responsibility seriously. Every piece of information she shared might save lives for the next unit. The flight home was filled with mixed emotions. Sarah was proud of the transition back to life at Fort Hood after the second deployment was smoother than after the first. Sarah had learned what to expect and had developed better coping mechanisms. She took 2 weeks of leave to visit her parents again, and this time the visit was less emotionally turbulent. She was beginning to understand how to balance her identity as a combat veteran with her identity as a daughter, friend, and normal person. The compartmentalization that served her well in combat could be applied to managing the different aspects of her life. When she returned to the unit, Sarah learned that she would be taking command of her own company within 6 months. This was a major milestone in any officer's career. As a company commander, she would be responsible for 60 to 80 soldiers and a fleet of Apache helicopters. The position was considered a critical developmental assignment, and successful company commanders were viewed favorably for future promotions. Sarah was both excited and anxious about the responsibility. She spent the intervening months preparing for command. She studied leadership doctrine and talked with experienced commanders about their approaches. She observed the current company commanders in her battalion, noting what worked and what didn't. She made mental notes about the kind of leader she wanted to be. She knew that her style would be shaped by her experiences and values, and she wanted to lead with competence, integrity, and genuine care for her soldiers. The change of command ceremony was formal and traditional. Sarah stood before the assembled company and accepted the unit colors from the battalion commander, the symbolic transfer of authority and responsibility. She looked at the faces of the soldiers in formation. Some she knew well from previous assignments. Others were new, having joined the unit while she was away at training or deployed. All of them were now her responsibility. She felt the weight of that responsibility settle on her shoulders like a physical burden. Her first few months as a company commander were challenging. She had to establish her leadership style and credibility with soldiers who didn't know her well. She had to balance the administrative demands of the position with the operational requirements of keeping the unit ready. She had to deal with personnel issues, equipment problems, and the endless bureaucracy of military administration. She quickly learned that command was about much more than just flying helicopters. One of her first major challenges came when a soldier in her company was arrested for drunk driving off post. The soldier was a young specialist with a good record who had made a terrible mistake. Sarah had to handle the disciplinary process while also trying to understand what had led to the incident and whether there were underlying issues that needed to be addressed. She ended up being tough on the punishment but supportive of the soldier personally, helping him get into treatment and working with him to rebuild his career. It was a delicate balance between accountability and compassion. Sarah made it a priority to know every soldier in her company personally. She learned their names, their backgrounds, their strengths and weaknesses. She spent time on the flight line with the maintenance crews, understanding their challenges and concerns. She made herself accessible to soldiers at all levels, encouraging them to bring problems to her attention before they became crises. This approach was time-consuming, but Sarah believed it was essential to effective leadership. Her executive officer was a lieutenant named David Park, a recent graduate from West Point with enthusiasm but limited experience. Sarah took him under her wing, mentoring him the way others had mentored her. She taught him not just about the tactical aspects of aviation operations, but about leadership and taking care of soldiers. David was eager to learn and absorbed her guidance gratefully. Sarah found that teaching and mentoring gave her a sense of purpose beyond just her own achievements. The battalion began preparing for another deployment, the third of Sarah's career. This rotation would be to a joint coalition base supporting operations against a resurgent enemy force. The intelligence picture suggested it would be intense combat similar to Sarah's first deployment. She drove her company hard during the pre-deployment training, pushing them to achieve higher standards of proficiency. Some soldiers grumbled about the demanding pace, but most recognized that Sarah's standards would keep them alive in combat. During a field training exercise, one of Sarah's pilots made a serious error that nearly resulted in a mishap. The pilot had failed to properly clear the area before conducting a low-level maneuver, and they came dangerously close to hitting a ground vehicle. Sarah had to decide how to handle the situation. The easy path would be to remove the pilot from flight status and send them to a non-flying job. The harder path would be to provide intensive retraining and give them a chance to recover from the mistake. Sarah chose the harder path. She sat down with the pilot and conducted a thorough analysis of what had gone wrong and why. She identified gaps in the pilot's training and attention to detail. She developed a remediation plan and personally supervised the retraining. It took weeks of extra work, but eventually the pilot regained proficiency and confidence. Years later, that pilot would tell others that Sarah's decision to invest in their recovery, rather than simply casting them aside, was a defining moment in their career. The deployment to the Joint Coalition base was the most intense of Sarah's career. The enemy was well-armed and determined, and combat operations were frequent. Sarah's company flew missions daily, sometimes multiple missions in a single day. The pace was exhausting, but Sarah made sure her soldiers had the resources and support they needed. She fought bureaucratic battles with higher headquarters to get spare parts and equipment. She managed crew rest to ensure pilots weren't flying beyond safe fatigue limits. She balanced mission requirements with the long-term health of her unit. During this deployment, Sarah's company was tasked with supporting a major ground offensive. Coalition forces were going to clear a large urban area that had become an enemy stronghold. The operation would involve thousands of ground troops and require sustained close air support. Sarah's company would be the primary aviation support, with helicopters on station continuously throughout the operation. It was the kind of large-scale mission that defined careers and tested units to their limits. Sarah carefully planned her company's role in the operation. She divided her aircraft and crews into rotating shifts to maintain continuous coverage without exhausting anyone. She coordinated with the ground commanders to understand their plan and requirements. She positioned fuel and ammunition supplies forward so her helicopters could rearm and refuel quickly. She rehearsed scenarios and contingencies with her pilots. By the time the operation began, her company was as prepared as possible. The operation lasted 5 days of continuous combat. Sarah's helicopters were constantly engaged, providing fire support, destroying enemy positions, and evacuating casualties. Sarah flew the first day, leading from the front and setting the example for her company. She engaged numerous targets, her skills honed by years of combat experience. She made command decisions on the fly, adjusting her company's tactics as the situation evolved. The ground commanders came to rely on her judgment and responsiveness. On the third day, one of Sarah's helicopters was hit by enemy fire and went down in a controlled crash landing in a contested area. The crew survived but was trapped with the wreckage under enemy observation. Sarah immediately organized a rescue operation. She led a flight of 3 Apaches to provide cover while a rescue helicopter extracted the crew. The enemy fought hard to prevent the rescue, and Sarah's flight had to aggressively suppress multiple enemy positions. They took heavy fire, and Sarah's helicopter sustained significant damage. But the rescue was successful, and the crew was recovered safely. The ground offensive was ultimately successful, clearing the urban area and dealing the enemy a significant defeat. Sarah's company had played a crucial role in that success. The ground force commander personally thanked her and recommended her company for a unit citation. More importantly to Sarah, all of her soldiers had survived the operation. Some had been wounded, and several helicopters had been damaged, but everyone was alive. That was the metric that mattered most to her. The deployment ended 4 months later, and Sarah's company returned to Fort Hood with a reputation as one of the best attack helicopter units in the Army. They had compiled an impressive combat record and maintained high readiness throughout the deployment. Sarah received her second Distinguished Flying Cross for her actions during the urban operation, along with numerous other awards. But the real reward for her was seeing her soldiers recognized for their contributions and watching them grow as professionals and leaders. After a short leave period, Sarah received orders to attend the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. This was a 10-month course that prepared mid-career officers for positions of greater responsibility. The curriculum covered military history, operational planning, joint operations, and strategic thinking. Sarah would be studying alongside officers from all services and from allied nations. It was an opportunity for professional development and networking that would shape the rest of her career. The college environment was intellectually stimulating after years of operational focus. Sarah engaged deeply with the coursework, particularly enjoying the case studies of historical military operations. Her combat experience gave her insights that officers without deployment experience lacked. She could evaluate theoretical concepts against her practical knowledge of how things actually worked in combat. Her contributions to class discussions were valued by instructors and fellow students alike. One of the course's final exercises involved a complex operational planning scenario. Students were divided into teams and given a hypothetical military problem to solve. Sarah's team was tasked with planning an air assault operation in support of a larger campaign. She took a leadership role on the team, leveraging her aviation expertise while also integrating the capabilities of other branches and services. Her team's plan was selected as one of the best in the class, and Sarah received recognition for her leadership and tactical acumen. During the course, Sarah was approached by a colonel from the Pentagon who was visiting the college. He told her that her career file had been reviewed by senior Army leadership and that she was being considered for prestigious assignments. He asked if she would be interested in serving in a strategic planning role at the Pentagon after completing the college. Sarah was intrigued. She had spent her entire career in operational units, and the opportunity to influence policy and strategy at the highest levels was appealing. She agreed to be considered for the position. When Sarah graduated from the Staff College, she was indeed assigned to the Pentagon, working in the aviation branch of Army headquarters. Her role was to help develop doctrine and plans for future aviation operations. She worked on acquisition programs for new helicopter systems and training initiatives to prepare the aviation community for future challenges. It was a very different kind of work than flying and commanding troops, but Sarah found it intellectually engaging. She was helping to shape the future of Army aviation in ways that would impact thousands of pilots and soldiers. The Pentagon assignment lasted 2 years. Sarah worked long hours in a bureaucratic environment that was sometimes frustrating, but she also gained a broader perspective on how the military worked at the strategic level. She attended high-level briefings and meetings with generals and senior civilian leaders. She learned how decisions were made and how to navigate the complex political landscape of defense policy. These were skills that would serve her well as she continued to rise in rank. After the Pentagon assignment, Sarah was selected to command an aviation battalion. This was a major milestone, the culmination of years of preparation and performance. As a battalion commander, she would be responsible for 300 to 400 soldiers and dozens of aircraft. She would have tactical control over multiple companies and would operate at a higher level of complexity than she had experienced as a company commander. It was the job she had been working toward for her entire career. The battalion she took command of was based at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, home of the 101st Airborne Division. The unit had a proud history, but had experienced some challenges in recent years. Morale was not where it should be, and there were readiness issues that needed to be addressed. Sarah saw the assignment as an opportunity to make a real difference. She could apply everything she had learned over 15 years in the Army to turn the battalion around. Her approach to battalion command was similar to her approach as a company commander, just scaled up. She made knowing her soldiers a priority, even though there were far more of them. She spent time with each company, talking with soldiers and leaders about their concerns and ideas. She identified the key problems affecting the battalion and developed plans to address them systematically. She set clear standards and expectations, but she also provided the resources and support necessary to meet those standards. One of the biggest challenges was improving the battalion's maintenance operations. The helicopters were not being maintained to standard, resulting in low readiness rates. Sarah brought in her maintenance officer and worked with him to completely revamp the maintenance program. They instituted better tracking systems, improved training for mechanics, and changed the culture around maintenance from something that was done when time allowed to a top priority. Within 6 months, readiness rates improved dramatically. Sarah also focused on training quality. She noticed that the battalion was going through the motions of training without really challenging soldiers or preparing them for the full complexity of combat operations. She introduced more realistic scenarios based on her combat experience. She brought in lessons learned from recent operations and made sure they were incorporated into training. She personally flew with her pilots and observed their performance, providing detailed feedback and mentorship. The battalion's performance on official evaluations improved significantly. During her battalion command, Sarah was promoted to lieutenant colonel. The promotion was recognition of her sustained, excellent performance and her potential for even higher responsibilities. She was now a senior leader in the aviation community, and younger officers looked to her as a role model and mentor. Sarah took this responsibility seriously. She made time to meet with junior officers, particularly women, to provide guidance and encouragement. She wanted to ensure that the path she had helped create would be available to future generations. The battalion deployed to Africa for a 6-month rotation supporting peacekeeping and security cooperation operations. It was a different kind of deployment than Sarah's previous combat experiences, but it still required careful planning and execution. Her helicopters provided transportation for peacekeepers, conducted reconnaissance missions, and showed presence to deter potential aggressors. Sarah worked with commanders from multiple nations, learning to navigate the complexities of coalition operations and cultural differences. When the deployment ended, Sarah's battalion had performed exceptionally. They had maintained high readiness despite the challenging environment, completed all assigned missions successfully, and represented the United States professionally. The division commander recognized Sarah's battalion as the top aviation unit in the division. For Sarah personally, it was confirmation that she had truly mastered the art of aviation leadership at the battalion level. As her battalion command came to an end after 2 years, Sarah reflected on her journey. She had come a long way from the young lieutenant who had been told by some that women couldn't fly Apache. She had personally destroyed 47 enemy tanks during her combat deployments, along with countless other enemy vehicles and positions. She had led soldiers in combat, commanded at multiple levels, and influenced Army aviation policy and doctrine. She had proven beyond any doubt that women could excel in combat aviation. But more importantly to Sarah, she had helped change the culture. When she had started her career, female combat pilots were a rarity and faced significant skepticism. Now, while challenges still existed, there was a growing community of successful female aviators. Young women could see examples of success and know that the path was possible. Sarah had mentored dozens of female pilots and officers, helping them navigate the same challenges she had faced. That legacy of mentorship and cultural change was perhaps more significant than any individual achievement. Sarah's next assignment was to the Army War College, another year of advanced professional military education. This was typically followed by assignment to colonel-level positions. Sarah knew she had a realistic chance of eventually being promoted to colonel and possibly even to general officer rank. But she also knew that success at those levels would require different skills than what had brought her this far. She would need to think strategically, navigate complex organizational politics, and make decisions with far-reaching consequences. As she prepared to begin the next chapter of her career, Sarah thought about all the people who had helped her along the way. Her parents who had supported her unusual interests and ambitions, the instructors who had recognized her potential and pushed her to excellence, Captain who had overcome his initial doubts to become a supporter, Jason Walker, her co-pilot through so many combat missions, Colonel Hayes who had shown her what senior female leadership looked like, and the countless soldiers she had served with and led over the years. Sarah also thought about the responsibilities that came with her success. She was a role model whether she wanted to be or not. Young women looked at her career and believed their own goals were achievable. That was both inspiring and humbling. She couldn't fail, not just for herself, but for all the people who were counting on her to continue breaking barriers and proving what was possible. The final formal event before Sarah left Fort Campbell was a farewell ceremony. The battalion she had commanded stood in formation, and she addressed them one last time. She told them how proud she was of what they had accomplished together. She thanked them for their dedication and professionalism. She reminded them that their service mattered, that what they did made a real difference in the world. As she looked at their faces, she felt a deep sense of connection and gratitude. These were her people, and leading them had been the greatest honor of her life. Sarah Mitchell's story was not finished. She would go on to serve in increasingly senior positions, shaping Army aviation for future generations. But the core of who she was had been forged in those early years when she had to fight for the right to prove herself. She had faced doubt and discrimination and overcome them through skill, dedication, and courage. She had flown into combat, destroyed the enemy, saved friendly lives, and led soldiers through the hardest challenges imaginable. She had proven that women could not only fly Apache but could excel in combat aviation at the highest levels. And in doing so, she had changed what was possible for everyone who would come after her had accomplished. They had completed every mission successfully and had brought everyone home alive. She had pushed herself and her pilots to new levels of skill and proficiency. At the same time, she was exhausted. 2 combat deployments in 3 years had taken a physical and mental toll. She needed time to rest and recover before the next chapter of her career began alive, which was more than could be said for some units. Sarah slept fitfully on the transport plane, her mind already shifting toward what came next. She would have leave time to decompress and reconnect with her family. Then she would return to Fort Hood and continue her career. She had proven she could handle combat, but there was still so much more to learn and accomplish. Sarah found her assigned living quarters, a small room she would share with another female officer from a different unit. She unpacked her gear and tried to sleep, but her mind was racing with anticipation and nervousness about what the coming days would bring.